Ruth Davidson joins me now. Well, look, let's start with this business about English votes for English laws, which David Cameron has been banging on about for the last few days. Do you understand exactly, for example, on income tax, exactly what it is he's proposing?
Oh yes, and we set this out, William Hague set this out in February of this year.
Well, do explain it to us.
Well, it's an extra stage in the legislative process. So, for example, we were talking about the budget. That goes through the whole House of Commons. When it comes to the shared areas of income tax, so that's things like where the personal threshold starts. It talks about income tax on dividends, on shares, on savings. That's all done by the whole House of Commons. But when it comes to just the rates and bans relating only to England, after this has been devolved to Scotland, and the Scottish will decide the rates and bans in Scotland, the rates and bans devolved to England will be decided by a separate committee of English MPs. So that's the extra stage in the process, and then the whole House comes back together to vote in the whole on the overall budget, and that includes Scottish MPs.
But the income tax rate for England would also be the income tax rate for Wales and Northern Ireland, right?
Well, in terms of, sorry, I should have made that clear, when it comes to English only or English and Welsh only, we're looking at an extra stage with a committee for people from those areas.
So it wouldn't necessarily be a committee of English MPs, it would just be a committee of MPs who were not Scottish.
Well, exactly, because already, or at this stage, this would have been devolved to Scotland. So Scottish MSPs, without any English MPs being involved in the process at all, would decide what the Scottish rates and bands of income tax would be in Scotland. And similarly, Scottish MPs whose representatives were not going to be affected by the change in income tax wouldn't be involved in the process. So it's fair on each side.
And this would not just be for income tax, but presumably for any matters which only affected or which the government considered, should it be a Conservative government, only affected England and Wales.
It wouldn't be the government that would decide which of this was. It would be the Speaker that would decide that. But yes, so for example, if there was a bill to reform GCSEs in English schools, for example, that would be voted on by English MPs but not Scottish, because that doesn't affect pupils in Scotland, or local government reorganisation for England. That would be decided by that as well, rather than because local government is devolved to Scotland. So it's essentially...
But the point the SNP make is that as long as the Barnett formula exists, many decisions which might be, in one sense, England-only decisions, if they have budgetary implications, will also affect Scotland. I mean, let's take a ludicrously extreme example. But we've been very
clear on that. So, for example, departmental spend will go to the whole House of Commons. So what defines Barnett, so what happens is, when you look at the amount of spend down south, that goes through the Barnett calculator to decide what comes to Scotland. The overall spend for departments, we've been very clear about, will be voted on by the whole House of Commons, including SNP MPs. And I would like, by Scottish MPs, whether they're SNP or not. What I would like to make sure...
Bit of a slip of the tongue there.
Well, possibly. What I would like to make clear as well, though, is I think that the SNP are being unbelievably opportunistic on this, because they have recused themselves from the very votes that we're talking about for more than 15 years. They've had a self-denying ordinance, and the fact that we're making that there's going to be a codifying of what they've already been doing for years, they've now suddenly said that that's a bad thing, even though that's what they've been doing in practice for years and years and years.
But just to be clear on this, let's say in England MPs decided that, look, the NHS, we think it would be run just as efficiently on 80% of its current budget. They could not decide to do that without getting Scottish MPs to agree to it.
Any bill that affected the departmental spend would have the whole of the Parliament voting on the stage, on the final stage of that bill. That would include Scottish MPs. Yes, we've been clear on that.
Right now,
and I think too, what's been quite interesting, and this will maybe be useful with your next guest when Willie comes on, because he's come out saying that this is in some way a bad thing. But Liberal Democrats have said that this is what they want too. They said not only in their command paper, which I've got here, where it said it cannot be right that a future government could pursue policies in England in areas devolved to the Scottish Parliament. The so-called West Lothian question can no longer go unanswered. We believe that English MPs at Westminster should have a stronger voice and a stronger veto. They've also got in their UK manifesto, Liberal Democrats believe in an English-only stage in legislation.
All right.
And that there should be a separate say on laws in England.
Let's talk about the Conservatives.
Gordon, if I could just finish.
May.
There is a reason that this is important, and this is important because the opportunism of my political opponents in saying that this in some way, this is what we're suggesting right now is our answer to the West Lothian question that's been around for 40 years. We've had this English votes for English laws in our manifesto in 2001, in 2005, in 2010, and we've put it in here. We've laid it all out in February. Other people haven't come forward with answers that they want. We've got the Lib Dems saying in England they're going to do exactly what we're doing, but in Scotland saying something else. We've got the SNP who for 15 years have in practice already done this, saying that this is some way bad. And we've got the Labour Party that thinks that, it doesn't need to answer a West Lothian question that Tam Dalyell raised sort of 40 years ago.
Okay,
I think there is an element of fairness here, and we've come up with an answer to it.
Now, Theresa May's on the front pages this morning saying that an SNP Labour pact would be the worst crisis, she said, since the abdication of Edward VIII. I notice even you are laughing.
Well, I think,
this is getting ridiculous.
The expeditionary force has been taken off the beach at Dunkirk. I think a referendum last year on independence, that could have had significantly more issues than this. I think that is perhaps a bit hyperbolic, even from Theresa and even from the Daily Mail, who've been spinning it, I have to say.
Well, she did say it, so she's being hyperbolic. Do you think your colleagues down south should calm down a little bit?
Well, I think that there's a real issue, and actually it worries more people in Scotland in a greater extent than it does people in England. What's going to happen to our country?
No, but statements like that aren't doing you much good up here, are they?
Well, we're the only pro-union party who's going up in the polls. You see that
but
again today.
Even you say that she's being hyperbolic. It can hardly be doing you much good.
Well, I've been saying since January, if you go back and check, I was saying in January that Ed Miliband, Nicola Sturgeon are halfway down the aisle to a deal. What's this going to mean? Is there going to be a second referendum? And people in Scotland are genuinely worried about this. I've been doing street stalls up and down the country,
I'm sure
all of the
have,
cities.
but
people have been walking up to me. People have been walking up to me and saying they are genuinely scared about this. Well, I like to make sure...
What about David Cameron? He said in the Telegraph, in an interview with the Telegraph the other day, that Nicola Sturgeon wants the next government to be a car crash.
Well, I think we've already seen, and I'll give you the example I've just given, that she wants to create division where there is none. The SNP have for 15 or more years recused themselves from English-only legislation. When the Conservatives say, if we get into government, we will codify this in some way, we will codify what you've already been doing, she suddenly says this is an outrage. That shows that she's not wanting the Westminster government to work well.
When Michael Forsyth, Lord Forsyth, as he is now, says that the way your party is behaving, with statements like the ones I posed as showing Alex Salmond with Ed Miliband in his top pocket, or Nicola Sturgeon in her top pocket. He says they are, and I quote, a short-term and dangerous view which threatens the integrity of our country. Is Michael Forsyth just wrong?
I disagree with Michael on that. I mean, I think, in fact, I know, because people are speaking to me every day about how worried they are about the idea of a second referendum, because we had a big, bold conversation, we came to a decision by some margin, and we were told before that decision it would be a once-in-a-generation decision. Not just Nicola Sturgeon said that as SNP, deputy leader and head of their campaign. The Scottish Government white paper said it would be a once-in-a-generation decision, and now that's being thrown in doubt. And everything that Nicola Sturgeon has done, in her 28 years of being an SNP activist, is to bring independence closer to Scotland. And the idea that she's running around saying she's desperate to put Ed Miliband into number 10, is that because she thinks that will bring independence closer to Scotland or take independence further away from Scotland?
The impression
and
that
I'm
is being
genuinely worried
given
about
is that your colleagues in the Conservative Party down south, and perhaps yourself, somehow think that the SNP having any involvement in the UK government is illegitimate. It's not just something you disagree with, that it's somehow illegitimate.
No, I've never said that. I mean, there are
so you're not saying
59 MPs elected from Scotland in the last Parliament. There'll be 59 MPs elected from Scotland in this Parliament. We've said as a party, we don't fancy doing a deal with the SNP.
If the SNP were to be involved in the government of the United Kingdom, that would, in a democratic sense, be perfectly legitimate.
Well, I've always said that if there is a stable government that can be formed and it can be taken to the Queen, our Constitution is very clear on this. Of course, all MPs have exactly the same rights and voting rights in the House of Commons. Absolutely. We just choose not to do a deal with them. And what's really interesting at Gordon is I've never heard yourself, any of your colleagues, ever ask Nicola Sturgeon if there's any legitimacy or anti-democracy about her running around saying, even if the Tories are the biggest party, we'll lock them out of government. So I think it kind of works both ways.
That, actually, but I won't.
Well, certainly not when I've watched
you might be right. Look, David Cameron the other day also urged voters in Scotland, Conservative voters, not to be fooled, I think was the phrase he used, into voting tactically to stop the SNP. Now, as you know, there are a couple of campaigns which I think may involve some supporters of the Conservative Party, or I don't mean members, but people who might vote for you. To say let's vote tactically to keep out the SNP. Now, you think Michael Forsyth is wrong-headed in his comments about David Cameron's attitude to the SNP, do you think those campaigns are equally wrong-headed?
Well, I've been really clear about this right from the start. I believe in a point of principle that you shouldn't vote for somebody you don't like to stop someone you really hate. Votes are more precious than that. You will never cast a wasted vote if you vote for what you actually believe in. But even on a point of practicality, I think the snow globe across Scotland has been shaken up so much over the referendum period, and the flakes haven't fallen yet, that if you're even looking for what it is that you think would be the right tactical vote, you might get it wrong and help happen what happens the wrong way.
In constituencies like Gordon, for example, which was a Liberal Democrat seat where Alex Salmond is trying to return to Westminster, your advice to Conservative voters
is to vote Conservative.
Yes. And
yes.
So under no circumstances vote for the Liberal Democrat candidate to keep out the SNP.
Absolutely, but you could equally ask Willie when he comes on here, what about Michael Moore's constituency in the Borders where it's shown that he's in a clear third?
Hang on, if I am a Conservative supporter in Gordon or indeed several other constituencies in Scotland, and I'm sitting watching this, what am I supposed to make of this? On 1 minute, we're being told that the threat of the SNP could create the worst crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII. And yet the next minute you're telling us under no circumstances should I vote for a Liberal Democrat in order to keep the SNP out. That doesn't make any sense.
I've given you the point of principle that I believe in. I've also given you points of practicality. You don't have to go far to see Professor John Curtis, the premier psephologist, not just in this country but across the whole of Europe, saying that it would only make a difference in 2 or possibly 3 seats. And there's a third part to this too. I mean, there's 41 seats currently held by Labour MPs in Scotland. That looks like it might fall some way. If you're looking at tactical voting in there, what's the point if you're trying to stop the SNP, if the Labour Party is about to jump into bed with the SNP anyway?
So when Lord Tebbit and Sir Malcolm Rifkind say that in some constituencies it would be logical for Tories to vote for another party in Scotland,
I think
we can add them to Lord Forsyth, and the tactical campaigns has just been wrong-headed as well.
I think the view might be slightly different from Kensington and Chelsea in Malcolm Rifkind's case.
Now, something else David Cameron said. He said,
people across
Ruth Davidson, he said, Ruth Davidson is the only Scottish leader who you can 100% trust to do no deals with the SNP. Can we 100% trust you to do no deals with the SNP?
I'm doing no deals with the SNP. I'm out there every single day fighting the SNP. I've been doing it for 2.5 years. I've stood on a platform on school halls and conference halls and church halls up and down this country saying one vote no to keep us in the United Kingdom, and I stand full square behind the Prime Minister, and we say as a Conservative party, and I was one of the key advisors to the Prime Minister, telling him at the start of this year he needed to come out strong and let people know early that we would do no deals with the SNP after the general election.
Okay, I'm tremendously interested in this because, of course, rather famously, your predecessor, Annabel Goldie, did deals with the SNP to keep an SNP minority government in Holyrood between 2007 and 2011. Are you saying you will not do any similar deal under any circumstances?
I do not wish to do any deals with the SNP now or after the election in 2016.
In Holyrood or in Westminster?
In Holyrood or in Westminster.
So we will not see a repeat of what happened between 2007 and 2011?
Absolutely not. Not under my leadership. And a future leader of the Scottish Conservatives, they can make their own decisions, but this is the decision that I make. Given how close the SNP took our country to the brink, I will not be doing a deal with them after 2016. Absolutely not.
Even in an informal way, as Annabel Goldie, there was no just to remind people at home who might not be political anoraks, there was no formal coalition deal with the SNP. It's just that, Annabel Goldie would go to the SNP and negotiate, for example, over the budget, and she'd get certain concessions, which were accepted by the SNP, and then the Tories would vote for the SNP budget. But you're saying that's not going to happen?
I believe in conviction politicians. I believe in voting in the way in which you believe. I believe in trying to make the country better in the way in which you think you can make the country better. So when it comes to my group in the Scottish Parliament and how they vote, we vote for bills that we believe in. We try and fix bills that we think are wrong. We try and add to bills that aren't quite sufficient. And we will take a principled stance in every vote that we take in the Scottish Parliament. That means no deals with the SNP, formal or otherwise. We may well vote for a bill that we agree with. We may not oppose for opposition's sake, but we will make decisions on what we believe.
But you won't do the kind of deals that you did in the past?
Absolutely not.
Right. Now, Nicola Sturgeon says this election isn't just about, or isn't at all, in fact, about holding another independence referendum.
Well, we're trying in our party to talk about economy this week. We had the Prime Minister make a fantastic speech yesterday.
I know
they
you
didn't
don't
mention the SNP at once. We want to get on to the economics and why we can build a better country, why we can make sure there's jobs there for everybody. But all of the questions so far today have been on the Constitution.
Well, hang on, Ruth Davidson. It's not me that's putting posters up all over England that don't say, vote Conservative, we've got great ideas on the economy. They have a picture of Nicola Sturgeon with Ed Miliband in a pocket, so you can hardly complain if I'm raising the issue.
We've also put posters all over the country saying we want to get to full employment. We put posters all over the country saying 2 million more jobs for the UK. What I want to ask you about the referendum is this, let's say Nicola Sturgeon does stick it in her manifesto next year, and let's say the SNP do form another Scottish government, a majority government on, say, less than 50% of the vote, like last time, but they are still a majority. Would you consider holding another referendum to be legitimate under those circumstances? Well, I think the precedent would have been set, but I think there's an awful lot of hypotheticals.
So you don't think the British government would be justified in saying, hang on a minute, you didn't get 50% of the vote in Scotland, even it was in your manifesto, fine, you didn't get 50% of the vote, you can't have another one.
The Conservatives have been clear about this for decades. I mean, going back to Margaret Thatcher, to John Major, to William Hague, to Ian Duncan Smith, to all the way through, we've said that Scotland has a right to self-determination. But I think the real question that people need to know is Nicola Sturgeon going to do that? Is she still agitating for another referendum? And her saying it's going to be decided by my gut isn't good enough for 4 million Scots out there that voted in September.
I wanted to ask you about electoral reform. Okay. If the polls are in any way accurate, we could end up in a situation in a few weeks' time where the vast majority of MPs representing Scotland are in favour, as you would see it, of breaking up the United Kingdom, even though the people of Scotland have just voted against doing that in a referendum. Just as Scotland was never as Labour a country as the number of Labour MPs makes it look, it wouldn't be as SNP a country as the number of SNP MPs. Should the polls be accurate?
I think I'm just about following you. Sorry, what
I'm saying to you is, my God, if that's not enough to make you change your mind and go for proportional representation, what is?
Well, I mean, we had that conversation a couple of years ago. We had a referendum on changing the voting system, and the majority of people across Scotland voted against the change. I mean, I think you've got to look at what the people of Scotland say, as well as the people in the rest of the UK.
Yes, but I mean, you would have about 8 or 9 MPs if there was proportion.
Well, I think at the last election, actually, we would have had a bit more than that, because we got 1 in 6 votes, but only 1 in 60 seats.
But this is a masochism in your part.
Well, look, I believe that people should know who their MP is. They should have somebody that's working for them and represents them, and I fight on whichever voting system there is in front of me.
All right, Luke, we'll have to leave it there. Ruth Davidson, thank you very much.